Welcome, focus learners, to another Explainer. Today we're diving into the absolute legend that is John Muir. You've probably heard the names John of the Mountains or the father of the national parks. Well, today we're going to look at exactly how a Scottish immigrant transformed into, arguably, history's greatest wilderness defender. It's a truly incredible journey from a really strict upbringing in Scotland all the way to the high peaks of the Sierra Nevada.
But, to really get John Muir, we actually have to start with a terrifying moment. A moment that almost ended his story before it even got going. Picture this. It's early March 1867. Muir is working as a supervisor in a wagon wheel factory in Indianapolis. Doing really well, actually. He was super inventive. But then, a tool he's using slips. It strikes him directly in the right eye, cutting the cornea. And then, as if that wasn't bad enough, his left eye sympathetically fails shortly after. Total blindness. He was confined to a pitch-black room for 6 weeks, absolutely terrified he'd never see again. But miraculously, his sight returned. And when it did, he saw the world and his own future completely differently. He realized life is just way too short to spend stuck inside a factory. He actually said this affliction drove him to the sweet fields, believing that sometimes we literally have to be nearly killed to learn our lessons. It was a massive, life-or-death inciting incident.
Okay, let's dive into this. Section 1. The Spark of Purpose. From Scotland to the factory floor. So how did he even end up in that factory in the first place? Well, we need to backtrack to his roots. Born in Dunbar, Scotland back in 1838, young John had a really tough, Bible-heavy upbringing. His dad demanded intense discipline. By the time he was just 11, he'd memorized most of the Bible, and as Muir later pointed out, that often came with the sting of a whip. This relentless work ethic stuck with him, though, when his family immigrated to the U.S. in 1849 to start a farm in Wisconsin. Fast forward to when he's 22, he enrolls at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, studying this really eclectic mix of botany and chemistry. Then the Civil War breaks out, so he heads up to Ontario, Canada, wandering through swamps and working in a sawmill. By 1866, he's back in the U.S. at that Indianapolis factory. So, despite his obvious knack for inventing and his university studies, he was cruising down a very traditional industrial path. That is, until that fateful eye injury derailed the whole shebang. Definitely for the better. Right, so with his sight back, Muir makes a radical, totally life-altering decision. In September 1867, he just sets off on a 1,000-mile walk from Kentucky all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. No grand route planned. He literally just wanted to take the wildest, leafiest, and least trodden way he could find. Talk about a total commitment to exploring the natural world. And it was a grueling trip. Down in Cedar Key, Florida, he caught malaria and nearly died. Luckily, a local family nursed him back to health. Undeterred, because that's just who he was, once he was better, he hopped a ship to Cuba to study plants and shells in Havana, before eventually booking passage to New York and finally sailing over to California. Which brings us to Section 2, Discovering Yosemite, a Wilderness Awakening. That arrival in California in 1868 brought him face to face with a landscape that completely overwhelmed him. He loved the region so much, he actually took a job as a shepherd just to hang around the area. He'd be out there scrambling down these crazy steep cliff faces, literally whooping and howling at the waterfalls. He even built a tiny cabin along Yosemite Creek and designed it so a piece of the actual stream flowed right through the corner of his room. He just always wanted to hear the running water. Pretty amazing, right? Now, jump to 1871, and his absolute idol, Ralph Waldo Emerson, shows up in Yosemite. They hit it off instantly. Emerson saw Muir as this sort of prophet naturalist and actually offered him a prestigious teaching gig at Harvard University. But Muir famously turned it down. He said he would never give up God's big show for a mere profship. The wilderness was his true classroom, period. Let's move to and see how this builds in Section 3, Glaciers and Wild Explorations. The Scientist in the Mountains. Now, Muir wasn't just some wandering nature enthusiast. He was a deeply observant, albeit unorthodox scientist, and he soon landed smack in the middle of a massive geological debate. Spending all his time out there, he became totally convinced that ancient glaciers had carved out the features of Yosemite Valley. But the big accepted theory at the time, pushed by Josiah Whitney, the head of the California Geological Survey, was that a catastrophic earthquake had just dropped the valley floor out. Whitney actually tried to completely discredit Muir, calling him a mere amateur. But Muir's incredibly detailed field notes eventually won over the top geologists of the era, who credited him with having the very first adequate conception of glacial action in that area. And, Muir wasn't afraid to let nature do the talking for him. In March 1872, a massive earthquake centered near Lone Pine violently shook Yosemite. While everyone else was completely panicking, terrified that Whitney was right and the valley floor was going to drop out again, Muir was thrilled. He actually ran out of his cabin in the middle of the night yelling, "A noble earthquake!" He spent the rest of the night doing a moonlit survey of all the new rock slides, gathering fresh evidence to prove the valley was still being actively shaped by natural forces, totally backing his own geological claims. To put this into perspective, his dedication to the science was absolutely relentless. Between 1879 and 1899, he took 7 trips up to Alaska. While exploring the Pacific Northwest, especially along British Columbia's Stikine River, which he called a Yosemite 100 miles long, he personally recorded over 300 glaciers. 300! The sheer volume of this groundwork basically laid the foundation for modern glaciology up there. In fact, today, Alaska's Muir Glacier proudly bears his name. Moving into Section 4, the fight for preservation, defending the land. As Muir spent decades deeply embedded in these environments, his narrative naturally shifted from just exploring to full-on activism. Because as his love for the land deepened, so did this horrifying realization that it was under severe threat from unchecked industrial and agricultural expansion. The biggest immediate danger he saw in the Sierras? Domesticated livestock. He actually coined the term hoofed locusts to describe the domestic sheep that were just devastating the pristine grasslands of the high country. Then, in 1889, Muir is camping in Tuolumne Meadows with Robert Underwood Johnson, a really influential magazine editor. Muir shows Johnson the environmental damage firsthand, and right then and there, they form a pact. Johnson agrees to publish Muir's writings to push Congress to create a national park. And let me tell you, the power of Muir's pen was a real game changer. In 1890, he published 2 landmark articles in the Century magazine, The Treasures of the Yosemite and Features of the Proposed National Park. The direct cause and effect here was staggering. His vivid descriptions, the spiritual tone, the urgent warnings, it all worked. It successfully pushed the U.S. Congress to pass a bill on September 30th, 1890, officially establishing Yosemite National Park. As this movement to protect American land really started picking up steam, a massive philosophical debate kicked off. On one side, you had Muir championing preservation. He valued nature for its spiritual, transcendental qualities. To him, these wild spaces were sanctuaries for rest, inspiration, and prayer that should just be left completely untouched. On the flip side, you had Gifford Pinchot, the first head of the U.S. Forest Service, who championed conservation. Pinchot was a professional forester, so he viewed forestry more like tree farming. His idea was to manage the nation's natural resources for long-term, sustainable commercial use. Now, both of these men absolutely hated the reckless, short-sighted exploitation of resources, for sure, but they represented 2 fundamentally diverging views on exactly how humanity should interact with the wilderness. And this brilliantly illustrates our final chapter, Section 5, A Lasting Wilderness Legacy, The Enduring Impact. The debates Muir sparked and the organizations he built are the direct link to the modern landscapes we get to enjoy today. Let's quickly summarize his tangible legacy. In 1892, he co-founded the Sierra Club and became its first president, a role he held for 22 years. The club fought tirelessly and eventually won the transfer of Yosemite to federal control in 1906, giving it way stronger protection. Over his life, he authored 10 books and over 300 articles, completely changing how Americans viewed their relationship with the natural world. Today, his legacy is celebrated globally with John Muir Day every April 21st, which actually started in his homeland of Scotland. The simple fact is, places like Yosemite exist in their protected form today as a direct result of his relentless advocacy. John Muir's story proves the sheer impact of a single individual who is deeply connected to their environment. From a factory floor in Indianapolis to the high peaks of the Sierra Nevada, his journey entirely redefined the value of the wild. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a question to ponder, inspired by Muir's life. How do you view your own relationship with the natural world? Are you simply a visitor passing through, or is it, like Muir believed, an essential part of your soul? Just something to think about the next time you step outside. Thanks for joining me today, and keep exploring.